Claire, a 46-year-old woman living in a quiet, well-kept suburban home, wasn't expecting anything to disturb the routine comfort of her days. Her husband, an organized and business-focused man, often traveled for work, leaving Claire alone in the silence of their house. That silence was something she had grown used to, perhaps even found solace in. But everything shifted the day Jason, her husband's 25-year-old son, from a previous marriage, moved in temporarily. Claire had only met him briefly at holidays and birthdays, polite encounters that left little impression. Now, after years abroad, he returned, older, more grounded, and with an energy that felt unfamiliar within her well-ordered world. His presence didn't just add noise to the house, it disrupted something unspoken. Claire found herself unusually aware of the way he moved, the way he looked at things. She sensed something stirring beneath the surface, a ripple in her otherwise still life. She didn't anticipate how that ripple would soon become a wave, pulling her into a space between memory, longing, and danger. It wasn't about Jason himself, not at first. It was about what his presence awakened in her, something she had long forgotten, something she thought she no longer needed to feel. Claire didn't plan for anything to happen. In fact, she had lived for years on the certainty that nothing ever would. But ever since Jason moved in, small changes in her routine began to reveal a quiet storm brewing beneath the surface of her calm, married life. It wasn't overt. It started with the way she noticed him moving around the house, how he took his coffee, how he leaned against the kitchen counter in the mornings, barefoot and silent. It was in the way he looked at her, not with arrogance, but with attention, the kind she hadn't felt in years. Claire had been invisible in her marriage for a long time, not unloved perhaps, but unseen. Her husband's compliments were sparse and automatic, his touches more routine than intimate. But Jason's glance lingered. His silence didn't feel dismissive. It felt alive. One morning, Claire passed the hallway mirror and paused longer than she should have. She noticed how the silk robe clung to her frame, how the light traced her collarbone. She hadn't thought about those things in a long time. She told herself the dress she chose the next day was simply more comfortable for the heat, but deep down she knew it was for him. Not for anything to happen, but because he saw her. And when he looked at her that way over breakfast, something inside her stirred. Not guilt, not yet, but memory of who she used to be before time made her feel like just a fixture in someone else's life. It was in the silence between them that the danger crept in. One morning, they stood in the kitchen before sunrise. She reached for a coffee mug. He slid it toward her without a word, their fingers nearly touching. That almost pulsed through her like electricity. He said she looked different, more like herself. It was a simple comment, but it reached deep. When was the last time someone had said that? Not about her clothes or appearance, about her essence. Claire told herself it was harmless, but when she felt his gaze resting gently on her back, when their arms brushed in the hallway, and especially when she caught herself waiting for those brief encounters, she knew it wasn't harmless at all. She had stopped feeling seen long before Jason arrived. But now, someone was looking. Really looking. The craving to be noticed, to be desired not for what she did or how she served, but for who she was under the surface. That craving had never left. The line was finally crossed on a quiet morning, a shared glance, a hesitation, then a kiss that felt less like betrayal and more like recognition. It wasn't wild or reckless. It was slow, inevitable, like two currents meeting in a river. Claire didn't stop it. And worse, she didn't feel guilty. She felt awake. For the first time in years, she felt like her body belonged to her again, not just to the routine. What terrified her wasn't the kiss. It was how alive it made her feel, and the realization that she wanted more. After the kiss, Claire found herself walking through the house as if she were floating. Her movements careful, her thoughts louder than usual. The moment had passed, and yet it echoed everywhere. The kitchen still smelled like coffee and cedar wood. The wine glass she had used was back on the shelf, clean and dry, but it held the memory of a conversation that had unraveled something deeper than either of them had expected. Jason didn't speak about it, nor did she. But the tension was no longer the silent kind that builds out of discomfort. It was a silence charged with recognition, not just of each other, but of everything that had been missing in her life. Claire knew what lines shouldn't be crossed. She had lived a life based on boundaries and routines, with a marriage that, while stable, had long lost the spark of being seen and truly known. But now she was in uncharted territory, not because she'd done something terrible, but because she felt something real. And real, as she was learning, could be both liberating and frightening. When her husband invited her to dinner that weekend, she went. She wore the dress he liked, curled her hair the way she used to, and smiled in all the right moments. It felt safe, familiar. But as she watched him scroll through his phone and chat about yard work and property values, she realized the connection between them had shifted. It wasn't that he was cruel or inattentive. He was present, in the way one might be present during a performance they've seen too many times. Their dinner felt more like a scene in a play than a moment of reconnection. Claire tried to feel something, nostalgia, affection, warmth, but instead she felt distant, like she was playing a role she no longer believed in. She went through the motions, answered his questions, responded to his touch, but her mind wandered. Not to Jason, necessarily, but to a version of herself that had long been buried under grocery lists and polite conversations. That night, as she stood in front of the mirror brushing her teeth, she didn't see a woman who had cheated or betrayed. She saw someone waking up to her own needs for the first time in years. That scared her more than anything else. Not because she didn't love her husband in some way, but because she was beginning to understand that love alone wasn't enough if it made her feel invisible. Over the next few days, Jason kept his distance. She noticed it. The way the guest house stayed quiet, the curtains always drawn. His absence wasn't angry. It was thoughtful, a pause, not a retreat. Claire didn't go to him, not yet. Instead, she sat with her feelings, examined them without shame. She wasn't rushing toward a decision. She was learning what it meant to live with emotional honesty, even if it meant standing in uncertainty. In a way, that was the most courageous thing she had done in years. Not the kiss, not the silence after, but allowing herself to feel everything in full, without running from it. As the week wore on, Claire found herself caught between two versions of her life. One was structured, clean, familiar, centered around her husband, their routines, and the quiet rhythms of domestic life. The other existed just beneath the surface, filled with memories that had barely formed but left a lasting imprint. Though Jason had said little since their last encounter, his absence spoke volumes. The guest house remained closed, blinds drawn, as if to signal that something had ended, or perhaps was being carefully paused. Claire responded not with action, but with introspection. She folded laundry more deliberately, organized drawers that didn't need it, and kept herself busy with tasks that seemed urgent only because they distracted her. When she stumbled upon his shirt, left behind, folded and nearly forgotten, she didn't mean to pick it up. But once it was in her hands, the softness of the fabric and the faint scent it carried awakened something raw and unspoken. She held it close, not out of longing for him, but for the version of herself that had felt alive in those few short moments they had shared. Her husband had left again for work, another overnight trip, and the silence in the house wrapped around her differently this time. It didn't feel peaceful, it felt like a question. That evening, Claire found herself pulling out a page she had written days earlier. It had no heading, no signature, just lines of truth that spelled out everything she hadn't said out loud. She had written it for her husband, but as she sat under the soft glow of the bedroom lamp, she realized she wasn't ready to give it to him. Not because she regretted the contents, but because she didn't yet know what she wanted in return. Forgiveness, clarity, freedom. She tore the page gently, folded the pieces, and tucked them away in the bottom drawer of her vanity. Not gone, just postponed. Later, she walked across the yard barefoot, feeling the cool grass against her skin, and knocked on the guest house door. Jason opened it slowly, eyes steady. Their conversation was quiet, heavy with mutual recognition. When he mentioned his upcoming job interview in another state, Claire's chest tightened. He was leaving, maybe for good. She didn't cry, didn't ask him to stay, but her silence carried weight. Before she left, he handed her a book she had loaned him. Inside it, tucked in the back cover, was a folded page, a map circled in red. "If you change your mind," he said softly, "you'll know where to find me." That night, she packed a small overnight bag, not out of rebellion, not to chase after him, but to create space, space to think, to breathe, to feel without guilt. When her husband returned the next day, she greeted him with practiced warmth. He didn't notice the change in her eyes, or if he did, he didn't ask. They ate dinner together, talked about weather, emails, a neighbor's remodel. She smiled in all the right places. But inside, something had shifted. Claire had found a part of herself she thought she'd lost. And while she hadn't made a final decision, she knew this: pretending would never again be enough. Claire moved through her home like a ghost wearing someone else's skin. She completed the tasks she always had: folding clothes, refilling the sugar jar, watering the garden. But her thoughts were far from the chores. She had returned from the guest house days ago, yet the weight of what had passed still clung to her. Her husband, Mark, had returned from his business trip with his usual easy rhythm, suitcase by the door, a peck on her cheek, and questions about dinner. He didn't seem to sense the difference in her, or if he did, he chose silence over confrontation. They had coffee in the morning, dinner in the evenings, and exchanged the sort of conversation that fills time rather than connection. It was a performance they both knew well, but inside, Claire felt like something had cracked, slowly, deeply, like glass under pressure. There had been no big argument, no shouted confession, only the awareness that she had become a version of herself she no longer recognized. That week, she found herself drawn to rituals, wiping down countertops that were already clean, rearranging spice jars by color, alphabetizing old mail. She wasn't searching for order. She was trying to hold herself together. Her thoughts wandered more than she'd admit. She'd wake up before dawn and sit in the hallway by the window, gazing toward the now dark guest house. It was quiet, lifeless, like something had ended. On the 6th day, she finally opened her laptop. The city Jason had circled in the back of that book. She looked it up. A direct flight, just 2.5 hours away. The idea of going there wasn't about chasing a man. It was about chasing the version of herself that had emerged in those fleeting, impossible moments. Claire closed the browser without bookmarking anything, but the thought stayed with her like a soft hum in the back of her mind. That afternoon, while doing laundry, she found Jason's shirt tucked behind a stack of towels. She hadn't returned it. She held it in her hands, pressed it to her face, and realized the scent was mostly gone, faded with time. But the memory? That was still vivid. That evening, Claire approached her husband with a calm, practiced voice. She told him she needed a few days away. Nothing dramatic, just time to clear her head. Mark offered to book her something, a spa maybe, but she politely declined. She wanted to do this on her own. Their bedroom, she packed a small overnight bag. She placed the book with the red circled map inside. No note, no farewell, only a glance around the space they had shared for more than 10 years. Everything felt too clean, too staged, like a hotel she had stayed in too long. She didn't feel bold or reckless. She felt intentional. The next morning, before sunrise, she left quietly. The wheels of her suitcase made no sound on the driveway. The sky was just beginning to lighten. As she closed the car door and buckled her seatbelt, her heart wasn't pounding with fear or regret. She wasn't running away, and she wasn't making promises. She was moving toward something, perhaps not Jason, not even a new life, but toward the woman she had glimpsed in stolen moments and now refused to lose again. Claire sat on the edge of her bed with the morning light spilling across the floor, painting soft golden lines that made the room look gentler than it felt. Her husband, Mark, had left early again, the way he always did. Coffee in a travel mug, kiss on her cheek, brief words about a meeting. But this morning felt different. The house didn't echo with loneliness. It resonated with reflection. Claire wasn't rushing to pack or escape. She didn't feel like she was running from her life anymore. She was sitting in it, feeling every part of it, and questioning for the first time whether she had simply been surviving in her own home. She reached into her closet and pulled out the dress she had worn the day she and Jason had gone to see the property. She didn't put it on. She just held it close, pressing the soft fabric to her chest. There was no message from Jason that morning, no knock on the door, no sign that he was waiting. But the silence didn't feel like absence. It felt like a space that allowed her to breathe. As she stood by the window, watching the breeze move through the garden, Claire realized she didn't need permission to reclaim herself. She didn't need someone else to affirm her worth, her presence, or her desire to feel more than invisible. What Jason had awakened in her, the electricity, the sense of being noticed, the awareness of her own body and voice, wasn't about him. It was about her. Later that afternoon, Claire sat on the porch with a cup of tea and her old sketchbook resting on her lap. She hadn't drawn in over a decade, but today she turned to a blank page, her pencil moving tentatively at first, then with more ease. The lines weren't perfect, the shapes were uneven, but they were hers. It felt like writing a letter to a version of herself she'd buried under years of obligation, politeness, and routine. Her hands were smudged with graphite, and for once, she didn't care. It felt real. That evening, Mark returned home. He greeted her with the usual calm presence, set his keys down in the dish by the door, and asked about dinner. Claire smiled gently, nodded, and went to the stove to finish preparing the simple meal she'd started earlier. They ate together in quiet companionship. He didn't ask where her mind had been lately. He didn't notice that she wore no jewelry, no perfume, and she didn't offer explanations. After he fell asleep, Claire stood in front of the bathroom mirror and looked at her reflection, not searching for beauty or flaws, but meeting her own eyes with quiet certainty. She didn't need to leave. She didn't need to act on temptation to reclaim her sense of self. What she needed was to stop disappearing inside her own life. And now, with every deliberate breath, every pencil mark, every choice made not for peacekeeping, but for presence, she was doing exactly that. She wasn't waiting for someone to see her anymore. She had decided to see herself. And for the first time in years, That felt like enough. It wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no suitcase at the door, no tearful goodbye. When Claire decided she needed to step away for a few days, it came as gently as a breath. Mark, her husband, didn't question her request. He simply nodded, smiled, and offered to help book a spa retreat or reconnect her with an old friend. But Claire already knew where she was going. Not to chase after someone, and not to disappear, but to honor the weight she'd been carrying. The quiet, unspoken ache of a life that no longer fit quite right. She packed light, a few changes of clothes, her sketchbook, a paperback novel she never finished, and the marked map Jason had left her inside the back cover of a borrowed book. She didn't tell anyone. There were no long explanations. She just needed space to think, to breathe. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Claire slipped out of the house. The street was still, the air cool. As the car pulled away from the driveway, she didn't look back. Not because she had made some final decision, but because she wasn't ready to answer any more questions, not even her own. The silence of the road felt like a gift. Her phone stayed face down on the passenger seat, and for once, she wasn't tethered to expectation. She was free to feel what came, without obligation or apology. Arriving in the city, she didn't rush to find him. Instead, she wandered, through streets that buzzed with life and strangers, through bookstores, cafes, and the quiet hush of museum halls. She noticed the color of the sky between buildings, the smell of coffee on sidewalks, the way people moved through their routines with purpose. It grounded her. She wasn't running to Jason. She was returning to herself. At one point, she stopped across from the building he'd mentioned, just to see it, just to stand near a life she might have chosen. But she didn't knock. She didn't send a message. That would have turned this into something else. This trip wasn't about what they had shared. It was about what she had rediscovered in its wake. That evening, back in her hotel room, she pulled out her sketchbook. For hours, she drew. Not perfectly, not for anyone's approval, but for herself. Each line a release, each shape a part of the voice she had once silenced. When she returned home days later, the house looked exactly as she had left it. Neat, familiar, quiet. Mark welcomed her with a smile, asked about her trip, and she answered with enough to satisfy without offering too much. He didn't press, and she didn't explain. That night, she lay in bed beside him with her eyes wide open in the dark, not in restlessness, but in clarity. Claire knew now that she didn't need to leave to feel whole. She didn't need to rewrite her entire life. She just needed to remember that she had the right to feel seen, to explore her thoughts, and to honor her own presence. Whatever came next, whether she stayed, whether she changed course, would be a decision made not out of fear or longing, but strength. Claire sat alone in the sunroom, a place that had always brought her peace. Outside, the garden swayed in the breeze, untouched and quiet, but her thoughts were anything but still. It had been a week since Jason left. No messages, no calls, just the memory of a choice she hadn't made. The house had returned to its rhythms, dinners with her husband, conversations about renovation projects, small talk over weather and neighbor gossip. Everything appeared normal, but under the surface, Claire moved through her days with an unfamiliar stillness. It wasn't sadness exactly, and it wasn't guilt. It was something deeper, a kind of awareness. She hadn't chosen to chase Jason, and he hadn't waited, but something between them had shifted her, and that shift remained. It showed up in the smallest ways, in how she dressed, not for anyone else, but to feel her own skin again, in how she paused longer in front of mirrors, not for vanity, but for recognition, and most of all, in how she began creating again. One afternoon, While reorganizing a drawer, Claire found her old pencils and sketchbook, untouched for over a decade. Her fingers trembled as she flipped through the pages. Faint cityscapes, incomplete portraits, scenes from a life once vivid. She turned to a blank page and began to draw. The movements were clumsy at first, but they didn't need to be perfect. They only needed to be real. Mark, her husband, noticed the change, though he didn't ask about it directly. He grew quieter around her. He lingered more in conversation, studying her with a curious edge. One evening, he brought home a small gift, a delicate pair of earrings with green stones, a color she hadn't worn in years. "You used to love emerald," he said, placing the box in front of her without explanation. She accepted them with a nod, slipping them in not out of obligation, but to acknowledge the gesture. It was kind, honest even, but not enough to mend what neither of them had fully named. In moments alone, Claire would sit on the porch and watch the sky shift from blue to gold. She found herself wondering less about Jason and more about herself, who she had been before routine dulled her, before expectation narrowed her expression. He had seen something in her, yes, but more importantly, he had reminded her to look again. The validation hadn't come from his attention. It came from the awakening it stirred. She didn't need a lover to feel alive. She needed permission, from herself, to reclaim the parts she had once buried under quiet compromise. With time, she began to speak more openly, not about the past week, not about Jason, but about her needs, her art, her silence. She and Mark took slow walks again, not every evening, not in perfect harmony, but together, and Claire understood finally that even if nothing in her life changed on the outside, something inside her had shifted permanently. She wouldn't forget what had happened, but she wouldn't let it define her either. This was her life, her breath, her name spoken aloud again, even if only by herself. The morning Claire left was unremarkably quiet. The sky was just beginning to brighten, casting a pale silver light across the driveway as she rolled her suitcase to the car. There was no drama, no tearful goodbye. Her husband was still asleep, unaware of the weight behind her quiet movements. But this wasn't an escape. It was a choice, a decision to reclaim her breath, her silence, her identity. Claire wasn't leaving for anyone, not for Jason, not to punish her husband. She was leaving for herself, for the version of her that had been slowly dimmed over the years beneath layers of habit, politeness, and self-neglect. In the rearview mirror, her home faded behind her, tidy and still, like a photograph she no longer lived in. Her heart didn't race. Her hands didn't tremble. What she felt was calm and certainty. There had been a time when stepping away from her marriage, even for a few days, would have filled her with guilt or fear. But now, it felt like stepping into her own skin again. The city she drove toward wasn't foreign. She had visited it years ago, long before marriage or motherhood. It held no promises, only space. Claire checked into a modest inn on the edge of the city, a quiet place with old charm and large windows. She didn't call anyone. She didn't post online. She unpacked only the essentials: a change of clothes, a worn notebook, the book Jason had returned with the map tucked inside. She placed it on the nightstand but didn't open it. Not yet. For hours, she wandered the unfamiliar streets, letting the rhythm of the city carry her. No one knew her name here. No one expected her to smile at the right time, or ask about board meetings, or make polite conversation about garden renovations. She was invisible in the best way, not erased, but untouched. As the sun dipped behind the skyline, she sat at a small cafe, sipping coffee slowly, the cup warm between her palms. Jason was somewhere in this city. She could reach out, She could follow the address on the map, but that wasn't why she had come. His presence in her life had been a spark, not a solution. He had helped her remember what it felt like to be seen, but it was up to her to keep seeing herself. That night, back in her room, Claire stood in front of the mirror. No makeup, loose hair, soft cotton against her skin. She studied her reflection not with critique, but with care. She picked up her notebook, sat on the bed, and began to write. Not a confession, not a letter, but her own story. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like a supporting character. She was the narrator, the author, the heartbeat. When she returned home 2 days later, nothing had changed, but everything had. Her husband greeted her with a gentle kiss and a question about her trip. She answered briefly. She didn't need him to understand all of it. She only needed to remember it herself, and she did. In the quiet mornings, in the way she chose her clothes, in the sketches she began again, line by imperfect line. She hadn't run away. She had walked home a different woman, one who no longer needed permission to feel alive. At its heart, this story is about emotional awakening, identity, and the quiet strength it takes to rediscover oneself after years of invisibility. Through Claire's journey, we see how routine and emotional distance can quietly erode a person's sense of purpose and connection. Her interactions with Jason don't just spark desire, they ignite a deeper realization that feeling truly seen and valued is not a luxury, but a human need. More importantly, the story reminds us that choosing ourselves isn't selfish, it's necessary. Claire's decision to step away, reflect, and reclaim her identity is a powerful reminder that growth often begins in silence, not chaos. If this story moved you or made you reflect on parts of your own life, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Please like this video, subscribe to our channel for more stories like this, and leave a comment below. What part of Claire's journey resonated most with you?